Together. Hey Ben, good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, so Dr. Bikman is a good friend of mine. We've known each other a while, and it's he's one of the smartest guys I know, honestly. He's really looked at really in a deep way the sort of root causes of disease. And he's not a physician, he's a researcher. And I just want to maybe go back over a little bit of your background about how you sort of got to where you are, and then maybe your book, Why We Got Sick, which is really very insightful about sort of root causes and sort of where we stand, because our focus here is longevity. So, obviously trying to avoid why we get sick is so important. So, yeah, why don't we start there?
hmm hmm Yeah. Yeah. So as you noted, I am a biomedical scientist and a professor. My research focus as a scientist is to study insulin as one main theme. In addition to that, my lab focuses on mitochondrial function. We do a lot of mitochondrial work, but it's all thematic of trying to get a better understanding of the metabolic influence in chronic disease. For example, we have published a few papers over the past couple of years looking at some of the mitochondrial problem in Alzheimer's disease. We have published a handful of papers looking at the differential effects of insulin versus ketones on fat tissue metabolism. So all of these things are just offshoots of our central focus, which is to just understand the role of metabolism in disease. And my evolution is you'd mentioned, just providing a brief overview there, was actually one that started with an interest in muscle tissue, but then in the late 90s, I stumbled across a paper that had just been published that documented how fat tissue was, as it grew, as it expanded, was capable of secreting pro-inflammatory proteins, and that these pro-inflammatory proteins called cytokines were then capable of causing insulin resistance, which was this foundational problem with type 2 diabetes. All of this was a total revelation to me. That, yeah, I was certainly aware of the twin epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes, but I had not even been interested enough to start to learn about what was the bridge connecting them. What was it about this fat tissue that was causing insulin resistance, the foundational problem with type 2 diabetes? There was two things that really set me on the path that I'm still on to this day. One, it was the learning that inflammation had a metabolic consequence. And that was, in fact, something that I went on to study for my dissertation work and my postdoctoral work, my fellowship. But at the same time, what blew my mind at the time was learning that fat tissue is an endocrine organ. That was an absolute revelation to me. I'd not been taught that before, even though in hindsight there were hormones that had already been identified from the fat tissue. The most famous of which was of course leptin, and still is. But I didn't know that at the time, and it set a curiosity, this burning wonder in me to want to learn more about fat tissue. And so what had started as an academic career that I thought would be mostly devoted to muscle tissue, and we do muscle work, it really quickly became a career that was more interested in fat tissue. And then, to kind of really make the long story short, during my postdoctoral work, we had a protocol that required us to be injecting low doses of insulin in animals, and yet they were pair fed. So the animals that were getting the higher levels of insulin, they could only eat as much as the other animals that were not getting insulin. They were just getting like a placebo, a saline injection. So they were eating the exact same amount, and yet they had much more fat than the other animals did. And then that was a challenging thing, and I assumed there had to have been some mistake, that the animal technicians were letting them get more food, and we really had to scrutinize the protocols, and confirming in the end that no, they weren't getting any more food. They were eating the exact same amount of food, and yet they were somehow fatter. And then it was a couple years later that when I got hired as a professor, that someone I went to church with, I was sharing this with them, and he said, "You sound a lot like this guy, Gary Taubes." And then I read Gary's book and came out of the closet as a calorie skeptic. And the rest is history.